مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. عندما هاجمت حماس إسرائيل قبل شهرين وقتلت 1200 إسرائيلي واختطفت 200 رهينة، اتخذ الرئيس بايدن موقفا حاسما بدعم الدولة اليهودية. وبعد مرور شهرين يبدو أن بايدن نفسه أصبح أحد ضحايا هجوم حماس. لماذا؟ لأنه في الوقت الذي حافظ فيه بايدن على موقفه الدائم لإسرائيل تغير العالم، فالزعماء الذين تعاطفوا مع إسرائيل في ذلك اليوم الرهيب شاهدوا على مدى أسابيع قصفا إسرائيلية متواصلا لغزة، وانضموا إلى المطالبة الدولية بوقف إطلاق النار، وهي مطالبة رفضتها كل من إسرائيل وبايدن لأنه تبقى سيطرة حماس على غزة. هنا في الولايات المتحدة يواجه بايدن انتقادات من داخل ائتلافه الحاكم، وخاصة جيل الشباب وطلاب الجامعات والأكاديميين الذين يحتاج إلى تصويتهم له بكثافة في نوفمبر المقبل. وبينما ينظر الأمريكيون اليهود بعين التقدير لموقف بايدن، يشعر الأمريكيون العرب بالغضب من موقفه الرافض لوقف إطلاق النار، وهم يعودون بالتوقف عن دعم بايدن من معركته ضد دونالد ترامب في ولاية مثل ميشيغان، حيث يشتد التنافس بين المرشحين ويشكل العرب فيها أقلية ذات ثقل قد تدعم أصواتهم فرس دونالد ترامب في الفوز بالرئاسة. لبحث السياسات الداخلية المرتبطة بغزة يسرني أن أرحب بنخبة من الخبراء المتميزين بيل كريستال، تود جيلمان ونورمان أورنستين. First it was Jimmy Carter, then George W. Bush. Perhaps today we have another American presidency undone by the Middle East. Let's take a closer look at Joe Biden and the Hamas-Israel war with a special focus on the domestic political implications of the positions the president has taken. I'm delighted to be welcomed today with Norm Ornstein, Todd Gilman, and Bill Kristol. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. So, Norm, let's begin with you to understand what's happened in American politics since October 7th. Let's first describe, just for a moment, what the world was like in terms of American politics and Joe Biden's position on October 6th. Norm?
Joe Biden has not been in a great place politically for some time. While we can't trust polls that are taken a year before an election, and they tend to reflect more a referendum on a current president and not the choices that are available, the referendum on Joe Biden has been a negative one. His approval rating has been well below 50%, at times below 40%. People in America are not happy about the economy. Portions of the Democratic base have not been terribly excited about things. But with all of that, if it turned out to have been or to be a one-on-one contest between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, you'd still look pretty favorably on Biden's chances. But we know that in the course of a year, things can change. And while he was in rather difficult place on October 6th, it got worse in the aftermath of October 7th.
So Bill, then came the Hamas attack. What was Joe Biden's instinctive response?
I think its instinctive response was to hug Israel close. I think a lot of that was genuine sympathy after the horrible attack, obviously. Also, I think a sense that he might affect Israeli policy more if he was unequivocally friendly to Israel right at the beginning. And of course, he dramatically flew to Israel, just a week into the war. For all the talk about younger voters aren't happy with Biden and this makes his life more difficult, and obviously it does in some sense. Sarah Longwell, as my colleague, has found in these focus groups that people just think the world's in chaos. There's less in chaos under Trump. So I'm going to, go back to Trump. I mean, that is just a problem. He didn't cause this war. I think he's done rather a good job of reacting to it. You could certainly say the same about Ukraine, but, presidents get penalized for things that they're not directly responsible for. Having said that, people like me who will be for Biden over Trump, were getting very alarmed in August and September. And I actually looked for 2 seconds before our show here. The polls haven't changed much, the Biden-Trump polls. He's basically a bit underwater, underwater on favorability, a little behind Trump probably on the matchups. And voters know both of them so well. This may be a rare case where, things could go badly from a certain point of view. The economy is going very well from most points of view. And voters just have a certain view of Trump and a certain view of Biden, and it's fair or unfair. And I'm not sure, it might be a rare case where exogenous events, external events, don't seem to affect voters' judgments that much.
Well, very interesting theory. But let's take a look, Todd, just at the politics surrounding the president's view of this conflict. In those early days, after October 7th, was there any significant difference between how Republicans and Democrats looked at the Hamas Israel war? Were there any real fissures among Democrats themselves?
The short version is no. There were a few very outlying Democrats in Congress who were not nearly as vocal in condemning Hamas from the outset. There are a couple of Muslim members of Congress who are Democrats, and they were more sympathetic to the Hamas side. And there was a lot of what we have seen, which is, Israel, they're victims on this day, but this day can't be taken in a vacuum, and a lot led up to this. So we did hear a little bit of that kind of whataboutism, as it's called. But for the most part, no. At the outset, the sympathy was entirely with Israel because Israel was entirely the victim. 1,200 people butchered and hundreds taken hostage. There's only one way for American politicians to feel about that.
Let me just focus for a minute on the hostage question, because hostages, it's not a new issue for Americans. Hostages go back certainly to the Iran crisis, hostages in Lebanon. Hostages are a difficult, thorny topic for American presidents. Norm, how has the administration handled the hostage aspect of this? Has it been a major focus of the administration's approach, or have they let the Israelis take the lead on dealing with hostages, even the American ones?
Well, certainly Joe Biden has been very forthcoming about the Americans who've been held hostage. And when we saw this one young child released, he immediately went on television, showed his empathy. And I think Americans, to whatever degree they focused on it, don't see him as shrugging about the hostages. One thing we have to keep in mind, Rob, is that when the administration cut a deal with Iran to release hostages, American hostages there, a deal which involved taking Iranian assets here and putting them basically in a secure place where they could only be released back to Iran if they met certain conditions. He got a lot of blowback on that one, and a lot of Republican politicians who inaccurately said that billions had gone back to Iran that they were using for terrorist activities. It's a delicate job to try and deal with hostages, especially if you're trying to find a quid pro quo. And that we have not seen yet here. It's quite possible, by the way, that when we see the additional hostages held by Hamas released, including at least 10 women who the administration has said, and the speculation has been, have been held back by Hamas, contrary to the agreement that they reached, because of the sexual abuse against them. And that may be true of some of the men as well. If it turns out that we find that that has been true and eventually they are released, there may be a little more of a backlash against Hamas that would potentially work to Biden's political advantage.
So, Bill, that early swell of sympathy for the Israelis across the board, that subsided, at least in a political level. What happened?
But again, the polls don't show much change, I don't think, over the last 6 weeks, but little erosion as you'd expect, since Israel is, whether necessarily or maybe a little, not so necessarily, others can debate that, killing a lot of people in Gaza, not all of whom were obviously Hamas operatives or even sympathizers. So, and some of them were children and so forth. So I actually am, I'd say, as someone who's pro-Israel and in general, somewhat heartened by the fact that the polls haven't moved very much. And the Biden administration has hung pretty tough on its policy. We're 2 months into this war as we speak. Condi Rice, the George W. Bush administration, when she was Secretary of State, that was a very pro-Israel administration, very much thought to be one, and I think genuinely one. She sort of told Israel, about 32 days, I think, into Lebanon, right, in 2006, enough, there are too many casualties and stuff. There were fewer, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, but there were fewer casualties in Lebanon over those 30 days than there have been in Gaza over these 50 or so. So I feel that Biden has managed to keep on his policy slightly regardless of domestic political pressure, to be honest. And, this, just to come back to one point at the beginning, it's so funny how foreign policy affects and doesn't affect American elections. This is something my colleagues know very well, too, from watching it over the years. I was part of the first Bush administration. Pretty good foreign policy, won the Cold War, kicked Saddam out of Kuwait, zero reward from the American public by November of '92. Ronald Reagan, and I served in his second term, and I came to Washington as a Reaganite. One of the real fiascos of American foreign policy surely was the bombing in Lebanon in October of 1983, with 240 Americans killed. We then pulled out. I mean, it was kind of, he had been advised maybe not to go in. Again, regardless of the policy, there was nothing good about it. It wasn't like, they were trying to do the right thing to keep peace there, but it was a total defeat and, again, a direct killing of Americans. This isn't, some Americans mixed in with hostages from another country. And Reagan had a massive re-election victory a year later. So, the intersection of foreign policy and American elections is not a straight line, I guess I would say.
But there are, of course, examples where foreign policy does affect the views of the electorate. I mean, one could think of Jimmy Carter and the Iran crisis, George W. Bush in Iraq. Not that he lost, but his standing certainly went down. And
Biden in Afghanistan. If you look at the arc of Biden's approval, it was robust. It was over 50%. In the immediate aftermath of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, it began to decline, and there's been a secular decline since. So that's been the major impact of foreign policy at this point on the Biden presidency, and it was a negative one.
Very interesting. Todd, when you look at the last several weeks, we can begin to see some clear differences within, say, the Republican and Democratic caucuses on Capitol Hill, certainly in the Senate, for example, on their approach. Somewhat nuanced, but real differences. Their approach to the Hamas-Israel war. Could you tell us a little bit about this?
Sure, and I think it's important to just draw us back to, at the outset, there was overwhelming support for Israel and sympathy towards Israel, but also from the outset, the Biden administration was planting the seeds of what we have subsequently seen, which is once things get really bad in Gaza, you're going to lose public opinion. And Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and many others, I've heard many National Security Council folks saying immediately, oh, we're all behind Israel, we're all behind Israel. And we know that democracies are very careful to minimize civilian casualties. It was clear from the outset that the Biden administration was sensitive to the fact that public opinion was going to turn against Israel and make it harder in Congress to get money through. And that is, in fact, what we've seen play out. So there are differences in the progressive caucus, in the Democratic caucus, on the Democratic side of the House side of Congress. The more liberal members are much more sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians, to the people in Gaza and the suffering there. And there has been pushback from that perspective against arming Israel and just saying, Bibi, do whatever you want. There have been other dynamics at play where the House Republicans have tried to tie aid to Israel to totally extraneous domestic agenda items. It's gotten tied up with US border security vis-a-vis Mexico, southern border, and with funding for Ukraine. And we're seeing that on the Senate side as well. And these are very complicated dynamics where there's overwhelming support in both houses of Congress to continue to arm Israel and Ukraine, but other issues have been brought in and linkages made that have delayed that.
Norm?
You know, I think it's interesting if we step back from this a bit, Rob, and look at the strategy that Biden has pursued. It's been in some ways a kind of subtle strategy, and I would argue the best one available to him. He immediately embraced Israel and Bibi Netanyahu, which meant that he was able, behind the scenes, to put some pressure on Israel to temper responses that otherwise could have been far worse. And that includes being able to get the ceasefires that we've seen and to get some aid going in. If he had not taken that stance, if he had gotten distance from Bibi, we probably would have had less leverage. And I think that's true going forward. But on the other hand, he is now kind of tied to Bibi Netanyahu and the government going forward. And to some degree, whatever happens now, including if there is a really bad response by Israel, even more civilian deaths, an occupation that follows that could be really difficult and severe, that may have some implications domestically for Biden as well. He did the right thing for America's national interest and probably for whatever happens in the Middle East, but he may end up paying a bit of a price for it.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to look at the details of that price. We're going to take a closer look at certain elements of the Democratic coalition and whether they may stay home next November out of protest at what Joe Biden has done in this conflict. In just a moment. Our guests today again include Norman Ornstein. Norm is Emeritus Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and one of America's wisest experts on politics, Congress, and the presidency. He's a contributing editor and columnist for the National Journal and the Atlantic magazines and an election analyst for BBC News. Also with us is Bill Kristol. Bill is editor-at-large of The Bulwark, an important voice in the Never Trump movement, one of Washington's leading traditional conservatives with policy experience that goes back decades. He was the founder and editor-at-large of the venerable Weekly Standard. And with us is Todd Gilman. Todd has spent more than 30 years as a reporter for the Dallas Morning News, including the past decade as its Washington bureau chief. He's past president of the Regional Reporters Association, and he has been elected 3 times to the board of the White House Correspondents Association. All right, Bill, can you take a look at the Democratic coalition? Progressives, young people, Arab Americans, who seem to be very angry at Joe Biden for the positions that he has taken. How serious is this breach in the Democratic coalition? How serious should Joe Biden and his campaign managers take this breach?
I think they are taking it seriously. Look, it's a very closely divided electorate, as we know, and a highly polarized electorate. Not going to be that many defections from one side to the other. There'll be a few. But you really can get hurt if some part of your coalition stays home. Republicans have plenty of splits in their coalition, but I've got to say right now, they all seem to be falling into the line behind Donald Trump, including all the establishment Republicans who talked a sort of semi-good game over the last few months about how they were going to really stand up to him. So I mean, there may still be a little competition here, and we'll see what happens. But the Democrats, who have an incumbent president who's kept most parts of the party quite happy with his mixture of sort of progressive and moderate legislation and governing, pretty hawkish on foreign policy, so a little more of a Scoop Jackson Democrat in that respect, pretty fair amount of government spending, though, and green energy and so forth. So he's done a pretty good job, I think, just politically, of calibrating within the party, so to speak, triangulating within the party. These foreign policy crises can put more of a pressure on you. Obviously, they're a little more black and white, you might almost say, or it's starker, the choices you make, right? And so yes, there are some defections from him. A lot of young voters, I think, were already not enthused about Biden because of age and other issues, but among certainly those who were less pro-Israel, combined with younger people being less pro-Israel, there's some risk of some voters staying home, I think, or going to third or fourth parties.
And Todd, is there a risk that Arab American voters are going to vote for Donald Trump, the man who implemented a ban on the entry of many Muslims into America when he first came to office?
Well, that is a self-answering question, I guess. But there are tensions. The current problem in front of all of us, in front of all the voters, is the handling of the Gaza situation and Israel. And that has certainly antagonized a segment of the population. There aren't a lot of places outside of Michigan where Arab American voters are a significant factor. And they're not that big a factor in Michigan, but in a very, very, very close race, they could be the deciding factor. I think to Bill's point and some of the other points that we've made today, the overall handling, there's no question that if, as bad as things have been in Israel and Gaza so far, as horrific as the images have been, if it keeps going for a long time and gets worse and worse and worse, I don't think there's any doubt that the American public is going to hold Biden responsible for that. And there is a much higher sympathy level among younger voters towards the Palestinian plight. And that's the side that is where the body count is stacking up in this.
And Norm, do you see this as a serious threat to Democrats next November?
It could be, for the reasons that both Bill and Todd have said. Think about an election that basically comes down to about 7 states, and where somewhere around 150,000 to 200,000 votes will actually make the difference in who gets elected as president. The Arab American votes in Michigan are not a huge number, as Todd said, but if the state is divided by 20, 30, or 40,000, that could matter. And he needs to have an energized base. Now, having said that, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. As we get closer to the election, people are going to start to think about other issues. And the immediate white-hot anger younger voters have, and many others have, as they see the plight of the Palestinians, may fade. And for younger voters, the abortion issue still becomes an extraordinarily important one, especially as we're going to see in a number of Republican states even more horrific crackdowns.
More complicated than I anticipated, but fascinating. Thank you all very much. Norm Ornstein, Bill Kristol, Todd Gilman, for joining us this week on داخل واشنطن. وبهذا تنتهي هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذا البرنامج، وخاصة حول تأثير الأزمة في غزة على الحزب الديمقراطي، يرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو مراسلتي مباشرة على @RobSatloff. أراكم الأسبوع القادم. إلى ذلك حين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.